All right, quiz tomorrow is on sections 1.3 and 1.2. We're going to start by performing the operation with our complex numbers. Remember, real numbers can be added to real numbers and imaginary numbers can be added to imaginary numbers. So we have to stick with the like term. So what's 9 plus 11? 20. And then what's 5i plus 2i? 7i. And then in standard form, we have to leave the real part first. Make sure the real part comes first. Let's go below to B. What should I do first for B? Awesome. We want to distribute the negative since that's touching the parentheses. So we have 16 minus 2. What's negative times negative 3i? Plus 3i minus I. So let's stick with adding the real parts first. What's 16 minus 2? 14. And then our imaginary parts, 3i minus I. Awesome, 2i. So this would be our answer. Make sure the real part goes first. And then I guess this is a C right below it, or maybe that's E. I don't know. We'll do the one right below it next. Here we're multiplying. How would I multiply these two together? 3i times 4i would be 12i squared. We can't leave I squared in our answer. What does I squared turn into? Negative 1. What's 12 times negative 1? Negative 12. Awesome. For C, we're multiplying again. How do I multiply these together? What do I need to do? FOIL. So let's start by multiplying our first. What's 7 times 8? 56. 7 times negative 6i. What is it? Negative 42i. 5i times 8. 40i. And then 5i times negative 6i. Negative 30i squared. What should we do next? Change the I squared to be negative 1. What's negative 30 times negative 1? It makes it a positive 30. So let's start by adding our real parts together first when we combine our like terms. What's 56 plus 30? 86. And then our imaginary parts next. What's negative 42i plus 40i? Minus 2i. Awesome. So this would be our answer. Make sure the real part comes first. D is super similar, so I'm going to skip D and let's look at F right below. What should I do first for F? Distribute. What's 4i times negative 6? Negative 24i. And then what's 4i times 2i? 8i squared. What does the I squared turn into? Negative 1. So this would be negative 24i minus 8. Can I leave my answer like this? What do I have to do? Flip it. The real part comes first, so it'll be negative 8 minus 24i. I'll do it. We have to FOIL here. 9 times 9 is? 9 times negative 5i. Negative 45i. 5i times 9? Positive 45i. And 5i times negative 5i? Negative 25i squared. Cody, what does the I squared turn into?
Negative 1.
Negative 1. So that makes it a positive 25i. So let's combine our real parts. What's 81 plus 25? 106. What's negative 45i plus 45i? They cancel out. So our answer would just be 106. And then just for fun, I'm going to call it G. What if I had something like negative 1 plus 2i squared? What would I do here? FOIL. We write it twice and FOIL it out. So squared means that we have two of them, so it's negative 1 plus 2i times negative 1 plus 2i. Now we can FOIL. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Negative 1 times 2i. Negative 2i. 2i times negative 1. Negative 2i. And 2i times 2i. 4i squared. What do we do next? Change the I squared to be negative 1, which makes it a negative 4. Let's combine our real parts together. So 1 minus 4 is negative 3. What is negative 2i minus 2i? Awesome, negative 4i. Be careful with the signs there. A lot of people will still think that these cancel. Just be careful. A negative minus a negative, you add the numbers, it stays negative. Negative 4i. Let's look at A. So we want to find the value of x and y. So here we set our real parts equal to each other and then our imaginary parts equal to each other. So we have 3x is equal to 27. What would I do to solve for x? Awesome. Divide by 3. So x is equal to 9. Now let's set our imaginary parts equal to each other. 6i is equal to yi. How do I solve for y? Divide by I. So y equals 6. So those would be our two answers. Let's do B. So let's set our real parts equal to each other. So 9x is equal to negative 36. How would I solve for x? Divide by 9. So x is equal to negative 4. Perfect. And then let's do the same thing with our imaginary parts. So negative 18i is equal to 6yi. How would I solve for y? I can divide by I. What else am I dividing by? 6. So we can just do both things at once. Let's divide by 6i. So 18 divided by 6 is negative 18 divided by 6. Negative 3 is equal to y. Just, those are the only two there. Yeah, so I'm going to do one more for extra practice.
Do you want for answer just leave it as x and y or put it in parentheses?
Just leave it as x equals and y equals, just like this. So I'm going to do one and call it C. So let's say we have 1/2 x plus 3/4 I is equal to 4 plus, we'll do 2/3 yi. So just to practice with some fractions. What would I do first here? Awesome. Let's set our real parts equal to each other. So 1/2 x is equal to 4. Now, how would I solve for x? I can multiply 2 on both sides. So we can either divide by 1/2 or multiply by the reciprocal, which is multiplying by 2. So it cancels there. So x is equal to 8. Awesome. Now let's do the same thing with the imaginary parts. So we set our imaginary parts equal to each other. 3/4i is equal to 2/3yi. Let's just get rid of the i's first. Get those out of the way so we can divide by I. So 3/4 is equal to 2/3 y. Now there's a couple different things we can do to get y all by itself. What should we do? I'm not adding them together, so I don't need a common denominator. How do I get rid of the 2/3 that's being multiplied to the y? We can divide by 2/3. So let's do that. Divide by 2/3. Keep, change, flip. So we keep the top, change to multiplication, and flip the bottom. How do I multiply fractions? Straight across. So this would be 9/8 is equal to y. Awesome. So if you are dividing a fraction by a fraction, you can keep, change, flip. Keep the top, change the multiplication, and flip the denominator. You might. All right, next, we are finding the zeros of the function. So when we have, just as a reminder, there's going to be 3 different types of questions that you see when you're solving or finding the zeros. So solve is the same thing as finding the zeros. You're solving for x. So it could say either one in the direction solve or find the zeros. So the 3 different types of questions we could see is one with parentheses squared. We could see one with x squared, or we could see one with x squared plus an x plus a number. For the first 2, when we solve these, so if you have parentheses squared, you want to get the parentheses squared all by itself and then square root both sides. If you have an x squared, just an x squared with no other x's in it, you want to get the x squared all by itself and then square root both sides. But for the third one, what would I do to solve? If we have an x squared and an x? Factor. For the third one, we have to factor. And then also, just as a refresher, anytime I take the square root of both sides, what do I need to do? Plus or minus. So don't forget, whenever you're taking the square root of both sides, you need that plus or minus in your answer. So looking at number 3, I have an x and an x squared. So what do I need to do to solve? Factor. So for A, what are 2 factors? Also, just as a note, when we are factoring, it has to be equal to 0 before you start to factor. So here it's equal to 0. We can go ahead and factor. So what are 2 factors of 2 that add to 3? 2 and 1. So this factors into x plus 2 and x plus 1. Now we're not just factoring. We need to solve all the way. I need it to be x equals. So what would I do next? Awesome. Set them both equal to 0. So x plus 2 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. We solve each little equation, so I subtract 2. I get x is equal to negative 2. Second one, we subtract 1, so x is equal to negative 1. So those would be our 2 answers. Any questions here? All right, let's look at B. We have an x squared and an x, so how am I going to solve this? We want to factor, and when we factor, what do we want it to be equal to? 0. So I got to move everything to one side. So I like it when my x squared term is positive, so I'm going to move everything on the right to the left. So I'm going to subtract 12x and add 48. So make sure you're just combining the like terms together. So I have 2x squared. What's negative 16x minus 12x? Negative 28x plus 48. So now that it's equal to 0, we can factor. How can I factor this? I could multiply the first times the last, but Gio, what else could I do? Take out the 2. Let's take out the GCF to make the numbers easier for us. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So I get x squared minus 14x plus 24 is equal to 0. So when we take out the GCF, when we take out the 2, since it's just a number, we can divide it and it goes away. So always just look for, if you have a GCF, it'll make the numbers easier and make it easier to factor. Now let's factor. What are 2 factors of 24 that add to negative 14? Negative 12 and negative 2. Awesome. So x minus 12 and x minus 2 is equal to 0. We set both parentheses equal to 0. So x minus 12 equals 0 x minus 2 equals 0. So what does x equal? 12 and 2. Perfect. Any questions here? All right, for C, yes. Okay, C, we have an x squared and an x, so how am I going to solve this? What do we do to solve when we have an x squared and an x? Factor. And when we factor, it has to be equal to 0. So let's move everything to one side. Again, I like it when my leading coefficient is positive, so I'm going to move everything to the left. So I'm going to subtract 6x and add 3. So 3x squared minus 6x plus 3 is equal to 0. What can I do next? Take out the GCF. What's our GCF? 3. Let's divide everything by 3. If our GCF is just a number, it goes away. So x squared, bless you, minus 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now we can find our two factors of 1 that add to negative 2. What are two factors of 1 that add to negative 2? Negative 1 and negative 1. So this factors into x minus 1 times x minus 1. We set each piece equal to 0. So x minus 1 equals 0 and x minus 1 equals 0. So what does x equal? 1. So we actually get the same answer twice. You don't have to list it twice if you don't want to. As long as you put x equals 1, that's fine. All right, next. Number 4, again, we are solving. So let's look at A. So I want to get the parentheses squared all by itself. So how do I move that negative to the other side? Divide by negative 1. Perfect. So it cancels out. So I have x plus 9 squared is equal to negative 64. Now that my parentheses squared is all by itself, how do I get rid of the squared on top? Square root both sides. Now be careful. What do I have to remember to do when I take the square root of both sides? Plus or minus. Now let's think. Let's take the square root of 64, negative 64.
Negative 8.
Be careful. What does the negative turn into? An I. We take it out and it turns into an I. So I'm going to have an I in my answer. And what's the square root of 64? It's a perfect square, which is 8. Awesome. Now we're not done yet. We need the x all by itself. It's got to be x equals. So what would I have to do next? Subtract 9. Awesome. 9 and 8i are not like terms, so I cannot combine them together. So x equals negative 9 plus or minus 8i. So just like before, the real part has to come first. Imaginary second. Any questions here? Good with A? Let's do B. All right, here we have an x squared and an x. So what am I going to need to do to solve? Factor. And if we factor, what does it have to be equal to? 0. So let's move the 36 to the other side. So we subtract 36 to move it over. So I get x squared plus 4x minus 32 is equal to 0. Now let's factor. What are two factors of negative 32 that add to 4? 8 and negative 4. So this factors into x plus 8 and x minus 4. What do we do next? Set them equal to 0. So x plus 8 equals 0 and x minus 4 equals 0. So what does x equal? Negative 8 and positive 4. So from the parentheses to when you have x equals, you always just flip the signs. Let's look at C. All right, so I have parentheses squared. What would I need to do to solve here? Get them all by itself. So what do I do first? Let's add 15. So we have to add the 15 before we move the 4. So when you undo your equation, it's like doing PEMDAS but backwards. So I have 4 times x minus 4 squared is equal to negative 13 plus 15 is 2. What do I do next? Divide by 4. So x minus 4 squared is equal to what? Awesome, 1/2. You have to simplify your fraction if it can simplify. So we can divide the top and the bottom here by 2. We get 1/2. Perfect. Now that our parentheses squared is all by itself, what do I do next? Square root. Square root to get rid of the squared. So x minus 4 is equal to what? Plus or minus the square root of 1/2. What would I do next? Add 4. Always check to see if you can simplify your radical. Here we can't simplify because we can't take the square root of 2. So x is equal to, can I combine 4 and the square root of 1/2? Are they like terms? No. So it'd be 4 plus or minus the square root of 1/2. So the plus or minus always just sticks with like what it's attached to there, and then you can put the real part in front. Technically this would be standard form. If you put it in the other order, so plus or minus the square root of 1/2 plus 4, that would be fine too. Just make sure the plus or minus is with the 1/2. All right, let's take a look at D. D is similar, but a little bit different. What should I do first? What do we have to do first? Subtract the 10. So we have to get our parentheses squared all by itself. So 4 times x minus 2 squared is equal to negative 8. What do we do next? Divide by 4. So x minus 2 squared is equal to negative 2. Jasmine, what do I do next?
Square root.
Square root both sides. So it cancels out with the squared on the left side. So x minus 2 is equal to, Lawrence, what do I have to remember when I take the square root of both sides?
Take the I out and do plus or minus.
Plus or minus. Awesome. And we take the I out because we have a negative under our radical. So it'd be plus or minus I. Can I simplify square root 2? No. So it'd just be plus or minus I square root 2. Luke, what do I do next?
You add 2.
Add the 2. So it'd be x is equal to 2 plus or minus I square root 2. Awesome. All right, let's look at E. So we have P minus 4P is equal to 0. If I have a P squared and a P, what do I have to do to solve? Factor. We're in a factor. Here we factor out a P. Our GCF is P. So I take out a P and I'm left with P minus 4. What would I do next?
Divide by 2.
So we don't want to divide by P because that's going to get rid of one of our answers. Set each piece equal to 0. So we set P equal to 0 and P minus 4 equal to 0. So P equals 0 and P minus 4 is equal to 0. P is equal to 0 is one of our answers. That's a solution. The next one, I add 4 to both sides. So P is equal to 4 and 0. So those would be our 2 answers that we have here. All right, let's look at F. What should I do first for F?
Subtract x squared.
Awesome. I see that I have an x squared and an x, so I know that I'm going to have to factor. And when we factor, it has to be equal to 0. So let's move everything to one side. I'm going to subtract x squared. Make sure we combine it with its like term. And I also need to subtract 14. So it's 2x squared minus x squared. X squared minus 3x, and then negative 7 minus 14. Negative 21 is equal to 0. Now that it's equal to 0, we can factor. What are two factors of negative 21 that add to negative 3? For this one, we don't have two factors of negative 21 that add to negative 3. Okay, is that the last one? No. We're going to do a couple extra just to practice. So you might see some questions on the quiz where you have to simplify radicals. So let's say we have the square root of negative 75. What would I do to simplify this? We can take out the negative and turn it into an I. Perfect, so that goes away. We have an I on the outside now. Let's find our prime factors of 75. What are two factors of 75?
3 and 25.
Awesome, 3 and 25. 3 is prime. What are two factors of 25? 5 and 5. Awesome. Circle our pairs. So I have a pair of 5s. What comes to the outside? 5i. And what stays on the inside? 3. So this would be our answer. Let's do one more, just for fun. No, only when you take the square root of both sides when you're solving, you put plus or minus. Here we're just simplifying, so we don't put a plus or minus. All right, let's say we have 2 times the square root of negative 200. What should we do first? Take the negative out. What does it turn into? I. Now let's break down the square root of 200. What are two factors of 200? 2 and 100. 2 is prime. Two factors of 100 are? Okay, 4 and 25. That works. What are two factors of 4? 2 and 2. Two factors of 25? 5 and 5. Yeah. But it's fine. We can break it down all the way. What gets circled? 2 2s and 2 5s. So what's going to come to the outside? So don't forget, we already have a 2i on the outside. I'm bringing out another 2 and another 5. What stays on the inside? The 2 that did not get circled, because we can only circle 2 of a time. What do I do if I take out more than one thing on the outside? What do I do? Awesome, multiply. So 2 times 2 is 4, and 4 times 5. So 20i square root 2.